Hey guys, I got asked an interesting question lately. Why are these wilderness area signs so far back from the trailhead? And it's a great question. And to explain it to you, I'm just going to explain a little bit of the history of the wilderness area. And to do that, we're going to rewind to the beginning of the 19th century when the outdoors was becoming a thing. There were sort of two schools of thought. One was that you should protect the wilderness and you should not have cars and not have access and make it purely wild. And a good example of that is like Kings Canyon. And John Muir was a big advocate of that type of structure for public lands. Now, there was another school of thought where it said, let's be more practical. Let's protect it, but let's also give access. We'll build roads in. We'll manage forests. We'll use the land in a responsible way. And I believe that was Stephen Mather who sort of championed that idea. And you can see that today in most of our national parks, right? There's roads. Roads would go right up to Yosemite Valley, the rim of the Grand Canyon. They provide access to everybody, but they don't offer a wilderness experience. And if you want to learn more about kind of that struggle between those two camps, I highly, highly recommend watching the Ken Burns PBS documentary on the national parks. It's long. It's probably 8 episodes. It's a long watch, but it's really, really interesting if you like the outdoors. I'll put a link to that underneath the video if you want to check it out, but recommend watching that. But anyway, we're left with these two schools of thought. Fast forward to after World War II, you have all these people recreating, you have national parks getting overcrowded, you have development happening, and in 1964, they came out with this thing called the Wilderness Act. And the idea was that we have diminishing public lands. We need to protect these wilderness areas that have not been touched by man yet. So what is a wilderness area? What is the Wilderness Act protecting? Basically, it is an area of land deemed to be primeval or untouched by man. So an area that hasn't been logged, that hasn't been developed, an area that would, I like to think it would be the same way it would be if we were here maybe 2,000 years ago walking through it. It would be the same as it is today. And there's a really good definition of it here that I found on the trail board. Let me read it to you.
Wilderness contributes to the ecologic, economic, and social health and well-being of our citizens, our country, and our world. Wilderness is a land of rare, wild places where one can retreat from civilization, reconnect with the earth, and find healing, meaning, and significance.
So that's the idea behind a wilderness area. Now, originally there were, I think, a few hundred of them. Today there's over 800, and every few years there's more and more wilderness areas, which is a great thing. Now, wilderness areas can be part of a national park, a national monument, BLM lands, that's Bureau of Land Management, not Black Lives Matter, or national forests. Any kind of federal lands can contain a wilderness area. So that's great. What does that all mean? It means that these areas are meant to be used for primitive recreation only, and they're meant to be preserved as primitive natural areas, whether to preserve the natural beauty, preserve a natural resource, or a habitat, whatever it is, it's not supposed to be touched by man. So when you're going camping or when you're going hiking, that means there's no facilities, right? There's no bathrooms, there's no roads in here, there's no picnic benches, there's no fire rings, none of that. It's a primitive area. It also means there's no motor vehicles, there's no drones allowed, there's no bicycles, there's no power tools. Usually, that's kind of a loosey-goosey one. They tried not to use power tools, but sometimes you have to use power tools. The idea is to keep it in a primitive state and not have it be developed. And if you want to know all of the guidelines for what goes into evaluating a piece of land as primitive, I'll put a link to what the Forest Service uses underneath the video. It's a PDF. You can read it. It kind of outlines how to evaluate a piece of land and decide whether it would be eligible as a wilderness area or not. What you can do, you can take leashed dogs in there. You can camp, as I mentioned. Some wilderness areas you need a permit. Other ones you don't. You just have to check. And you can basically enjoy it in a primitive way. So that brings me back to the question, why are these signs so far back? Well, it goes back to when they first started making the wilderness areas. When they first started making them, they thought that if they wanted to have a area that was natural, you would need to have a buffer between the boundary of the wilderness area and development. So if I'm in here, I don't want to be hiking maybe on the border of wilderness area and it's right next to an interstate highway where I can hear, big rigs and traffic. They didn't want that. So if you look at the boundaries of a lot of wilderness areas, you'll notice that they're almost always set back from development. And that's because they wanted this buffer here to basically give the wilderness area space and preserve that primeval, primitive, atmosphere in the wilderness area. So that's why you will see these pretty consistently farther back on the trail. Now, of course, the area within the wilderness area is protected. The buffer is not protected. So, the people who want to build strip malls and developments and all of that have fought the federal government in court to try to be able to build in these buffer areas. And the courts ruled that there's nothing actually in the Wilderness Act that says there needs to be a buffer area. So you will see some development that comes up to the border of the wilderness area, unfortunately. But still, when land managers lay these out, I think the intention is still to give it a buffer, preserve that primitive feel once you're in the wilderness area. Now, of course, there are loopholes to the law because what would a government regulation be without loopholes? There are a few exceptions to the protection of a wilderness area. They can be used for mining, but they're generally not. They can be used for infrastructure. So if we needed to build an interstate, they could theoretically do it right through here. And they could be used for military. So kind of reasonable. I found that in general, they are left untouched, which is a good thing. So I mentioned earlier that every few years, there's more and more wilderness areas. And if you want to support the addition of more wilderness areas and help the protection of existing wilderness areas, there's a few things that you can do. First, you can vote for people who support protecting the wilderness and wilderness areas, and you'd be surprised. It's pretty bipartisan. You might think it skews one way, but it's not. So what I would advise is don't listen to radio, TV, print, all these political people who want to rile you up and really don't have probably the best interests of the wilderness areas in their minds. And do your own homework. Read legislation that comes out, see who's voting for what, ask your representatives if they're voting for it. If not, ask them to vote for it. REI has a pretty decent kind of action network that you can subscribe to, and they'll send you an email when piece of legislation comes out, and they'll tell you about it. So I'll put a link to that under the video as well. You can subscribe to that or not, or do your own homework. The other thing is something called the Wilderness Society, and they've been around since the early 1900s, and they were one of the first nonprofit groups to advocate for the protection of wildernesses like these, and having it be a protected place. And some of the early members were Ansel Adams, Benton, his last name escapes me, the guy who was the grandfather of the Appalachian Trail, and Bob Marshall, who was one of the first Forest Service guys who kind of shaped what the recreational aspects of the national forests are today that we have. All big figures in the historic development of the outdoors here in the United States. But they've been advocating for this type of thing for quite a while. They advocate for new wilderness areas, and you can support them. You can go to their website. You can subscribe to their newsletter, all of that stuff. I'll put a link to that under the video as well, so you can check that out if you want to dive deeper on wilderness areas. But hopefully from this short video, you kind of have an appreciation of what it means when you cross into one of these things, why these things are so far back in reference to the first question, and how to enjoy them when you're out there. All right, guys, I'll see you in the wilderness areas. Bye.